Hi folks, hope you're doing good. A bit of a shorter vid this morning, I think. What I wanted to do is I've had some ideas. We've been listening to lots of bands now. I think we've got about 150, 160 bands through. We've heard all sorts of bands, all sorts of genres, all sorts of standards of mixing. And in terms of the mixing, there's been a few things that have come through now in all those bands, a few common kind of mixing things that I just want to mention, just want to talk about. They're not really mistakes, but they're just things that I want bands who are producing their own music or even going into the studio to be able to go in, having an idea what to think about and the things to watch out for, the kind of common pitfalls, if you like. I'll just get them up on the screen so you can see what I'm talking about. It's not very much. In general, the mixes are very good, I'd have to say. Guitars particularly sit well in the mix. They've got good distortions. Everyone's got their own tone. But, you know, the guitars sit well in the mix. They're nice and beefy. So in general, guitars, yeah, pretty good. But there's a few things here, as you can see, that I'm going to mention that do stand out, that have come up quite a few times now. So I'm going to mention it just so people have got it fresh in their mind and they're thinking about these things and asking themselves the questions, have they made mistakes on these kind of things in their mixes? Now, as you see, the first one is clicky drums. Now, I've mentioned clicky drums a whole bunch of times. Everyone loves clicky drums. I love clicky drums. They cut through the mix great. They're great on fast double bass and things like that for keeping the clarity of the double bass. But what they do is cut through the mix. It doesn't matter how thick your mix is, how much distortion you've got. The clicky drum is going to cut through the mix because it sits in a different part of the waveform to all of that noise. And because of that, what we have found with a couple of bands now or a couple of mixes is that the clicky drum has been a bit too loud for the rest of the mix, and it's kind of sat on top of the mix because of that and not deep within it like it really should. Now, the way to deal with this is very, very simple. It's just turn them down. You don't need to do anything else than that. It's just too much volume. What you want to be doing is get your mouse on the slider in your mixer. Slide it right down until the drums cut out, till you can't really hear the click. It's not cutting through the mix. And then slowly drag it up until the click starts to cut through the mix. And as you're hearing it cut through the mix, stop. That's enough volume. As long as you can hear it, it's cutting through the mix. Anything else that you add on top of it then in terms of volume is just extra, doesn't need it. As long as you can hear the click, it's cutting through. That's what you need to know. So ask yourself, are my clicks too loud? Because they have been a couple of times. The next thing I'm going to mention is thin cymbals. Now, thin cymbals work for some bands and some styles. So if that's your band, ignore this one. But for generally most metal, you want to get the biggest sound that you can, the widest sound, as loud as you can. Make it really kind of pummel the listener. That's what metal's all about, in my opinion. And the thing with cymbals is, because you've got low guitars, you've got distortion and all of that, the cymbals are going to be the highest frequencies in your mix in general. And what you're going to want to do with that, or one thing that you can do with that, is with very washy cymbals or with a lot of reverb and sustain on your cymbals, you create a big backwash in the higher frequencies of the sound. And what that can do is just widen up your sound, make it deeper, and make it more layered, and just give it a bit more oomph. So think about adding some reverb and washing out your cymbals. If you're choosing different cymbal samples, try and choose ones with a bit more sustain, ones that don't just fade out really quickly, and create some backwash in your music when you go onto the cymbals, if you're onto the rides are really washy. So yeah, think about that. Unless it suits your music to have thin cymbals, try and create a nice wash in the high end of your frequencies. Now, going to the other end of the frequencies, we're going to talk about your bass. And we've mentioned the bass a bunch of times because if there's one thing that doesn't cut through the mix, it's the bass, or you can't even barely hear it sometimes. Now, that's fairly typical in metal music. It's getting better, but back in the day, we've heard all the things about Jason Newsted, all the memes about that. They used to cut the bass out pretty much. But we want bass in our music. Bass adds a lot of kind of oomph and dirt and low end to your music, depending on the tone of it. So you got to think about your bass, especially if you're in a one-man band. I'm in a one-man band pretty much, and I'm a guitarist. I can do the drums and things like that, but when it comes to the bass, I always seem to neglect it and just do a bit of root note stuff. Don't think about it too much. Don't think about the tone, even though I've spent years crafting my guitar tone. I haven't spent 5 minutes crafting a bass tone. So I need to, this advice applies to myself, but it applies to pretty much everyone else out there as well. So make sure you're thinking about your guitar, your bass guitar, cutting through the mix, cutting over the top, but not too much of your guitars. Now, the way you need to think about that is, if you're using a clean bass, you want to think about the high end, the mids of the bass, and make sure that that kind of cuts over the guitars, but only just slightly. Again, like you do with the clicky drums, what you want to do is you want to lower the volume so that it's totally not in the mix, and then gradually bring up the volume of the bass until you can start hearing it just cut over the guitars, or just at the same level as the guitars, but still with that clarity that you can hear it. That's the sweet spot, and that's where you want to be sitting the volume of your bass. Now, if you're using very distorted bass, very muffled bass and things like that, what you need to think about is the sizzle, the kind of fizz of the bass tone, and that's going to sit in a similar area as your guitar fizz as well, kind of around the 2 to 5k mark usually. Now, usually you cut a lot of that out when you're doing the bass frequencies and you're EQing bass, but make sure you've got a little bit of fizzle in there, a bit of kind of, crackle and things like that, and make sure that again, just slightly clips over the guitar or is the same volume as the guitar, so that you can always hear it in the mix. If there's parts of your mix where you can't hear the bass at all, that's kind of something you can remedy and make sound a bit better, because we want to hear the bass, Everyone likes to hear a bit of bass. And then the last one I'm going to talk about here is vocal layering. This applies if you're doing cleans or if you're doing growls and no cleans as well. Think about doing a bit of vocal layering just to, again, add depth, add width, and add thickness to the sound, because we want to get our music sounding as thick and beefy as hell, for the most part anyway. As I say, if this doesn't suit the style of your band, just ignore what I'm saying. But if you're wanting to make a nice, beefy, chunky metal, badass kind of tone and mix, you're going to want to do a bit of vocal layering. And what you want to get you do is, if you do vocals yourself, or get your vocalist to do 2 very nice, almost identical recordings of the vocal. And then what you can do with the second version is add different effects, add some distortion, add some reverbs, things like that, and then lower the volume of that one slightly in the mix, add a bit of layer, add a bit of depth, maybe put some delays on that as well, and then you'll have your kind of main vocal, but you'll have a backwash of a different vocal with a different tone and a different sound, but if they're both nice and tight performances, it should sit quite nicely with the main vocal, and that will just add a bit more depth to your music, with your thick cymbals, with your bass cutting through, and with your drums and your clicky drums sat nicely in the mix. You should have a pretty nice mix. So just ask yourself those questions. Are my drums too loud? Are they too clicky? Are my cymbals too thin? Is my bass cutting through? Can I hear it over the guitars? And have I done a bit of vocal layering, and is my vocals sounding nice and thick, the kind of thing like my guitars are sounding as well? So yeah, those are the kind of things I want to talk about. Just a bit of a short vid. Just when you're doing your own mixes, or if you're going into the studio, have these things in mind, and you should end up with a slightly better mix than if you haven't thought about them whatsoever. So there you go. Hope that was useful. See ya. Bye.